The sun in Willow Creek, Iowa had always been generous, but for Walter Sterling, that August heat felt like a cruel mockery. Walter was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a brow etched with the worry that only money, lots of money, could buy. He wasn't just a farmer. He was the benchmark, the owner of Sterling Farms, the most technologically advanced farm in the entire region. His neighbors still used old tractors and relied on experience passed down through generations. Walter, on the other hand, trusted only satellites, drones that monitored soil moisture every square meter, and lab reports coming directly from Chicago. He had invested millions over the past 5 years to transform Sterling Farms into a perfect production machine. And yet, perfection had turned to dust. That year should have been the peak. The weather cooperated like never before. The rain came at the right time, the sun burned just right. The agricultural consultants, whom Walter paid handsomely, guaranteed that the corn and soybean harvest would be a record. But right at harvest time, the inexplicable happened. Walter was in his office, which looked more like a NASA command center, staring at screens displaying growth charts. On all the neighboring farms, the lines were rising sharply. On his, the line was stagnant, or worse, plummeting. He got into his luxury Jeep, a model that didn't even look like it was made for mud, and drove to Field 7, where the corn should be 3 meters high, golden, and ready for the harvest that would fill his silos and his bank account. What he found was a field of skeletons. The corn stalks were withered, dry, with small stunted ears. It wasn't a pest infestation. There were no visible insects. It wasn't a lack of water, as the drip irrigation system controlled by artificial intelligence had delivered the exact dose of H2O. The land seemed to have rejected life. Where there should have been the sweet smell of a ripe harvest, there was only the aroma of dust and failure. Walter felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He stepped onto the ground. It was dry, yes, but not compacted. It was well tended, fertilized with the best and most expensive nutrients in the world. He bent down and picked up a handful of dark earth. It crumbled between his fingers, looking tired. "What the hell is going on here?" he growled at the foreman, a man named Sam, who had been there for 30 years and whom Walter had always treated as a second-class employee because he didn't understand cutting-edge technology. Sam, whose face was sunburnt and who possessed the wisdom of someone who truly knows the land, shook his head. "Mr. Sterling, I've never seen anything like it. If it were a drought, Thorn Farm would be in the same condition. If it were a disease, the laboratories would have already found it." The mention of the Thorn Farm was a punch to the gut for Walter. Elias Thorn, the neighbor who still used a tractor-pulled plow from the 1970s, had the most bountiful harvest Walter had ever seen. Elias's corn seemed to glow in the sun, a green and golden affront, separated from Walter's misery by only a barbed wire fence. Walter dismissed Sam with a curt wave. He didn't need opinions from someone who didn't have a PhD in agronomy. He needed facts, science, a solution that could be bought. Everything you've heard so far is just the beginning of Walter Sterling's downfall, because what truly transformed his destiny is yet to come. You will still discover how the intervention of the mysterious Mary O'Connell changed not only the farm, but the soul of a man who believed he controlled nature itself. Before we move on to this pivotal turning point in the story, like the video and subscribe to the channel. This empowers us to continue bringing you profound, moving, and insightful stories like Walter's. He spent the next few weeks in a frenzy of expensive denial. He called in more experts. Scientists from prestigious universities came, wearing white coats and carrying complex equipment. They drilled into the soil, analyzed the DNA of the dying plants, tested for acidity, alkalinity, and the presence of rare minerals. The reports were always the same. "The soil is perfect, Mr. Sterling. The weather was perfect. There are no known pathogens. It is statistically impossible that this crop failed." Impossible but real. Walter couldn't accept it. He had built his empire on logic and the ability to dominate nature with money and machines. The idea of something inexplicable brought him to the brink of a nervous breakdown. He began having nightmares about the earth opening up and swallowing his expensive tractors. The loss of the first harvest was devastating. He had to sell some of his state-of-the-art equipment just to cover the losses and pay off the bank loans he had taken out, counting on the promised profit. "Let's go for the second crop," he told himself, in a desperate attempt to maintain control. "We'll plant soybeans, but this time I'll double the investment in fertilizers and protection. We'll saturate this land with life." He did exactly that. He used genetically modified seeds that promised resistance to everything. He poured tons of chemicals that guaranteed maximum nutrition. Walter's land, which was already rich, became even more fortified, more vitamin-rich than an Olympic athlete. For a brief moment, at the beginning of spring, he felt a sense of relief. The small soybean seedlings sprouted strong dark green. He smiled, feeling that he had conquered the mystery with the brute force of his capital. But as soon as the plants reached about 30 centimeters, the phenomenon returned. It wasn't a rapid wilting, it was a slow decline, as if the plants had lost the will to live. They stopped growing. The leaves turned yellow, then brown, and the sap stopped circulating. They simply gave up. This time, the loss was even greater. Walter could no longer hide the situation. News spread through Willow Creek. The Sterling Empire was crumbling and no one knew why. People whispered at the cooperative and the local diner. "It's a curse," the elders would say, always suspicious of Walter's arrogance and his obsession with ignoring natural cycles. "It's karma," others said, recalling how Walter had bought and expropriated land from traditional families years ago, treating it as mere numbers on a financial statement. Walter Sterling, the man who laughed at superstition, began to feel a primal fear. He walked through the fields at night, illuminated only by the full moon, searching for something that could explain the disaster. The sound of his footsteps on the barren earth was the only sound, besides the wind that blew indifferently on the other side of the fence, where Elias Thorne's corn whispered, strong and healthy. The humiliation was unbearable. Walter had spent the equivalent of a small nation's gross domestic product on technology to secure the harvest, and Mother Nature was slapping him in the face. He was losing everything. One afternoon, Walter stood on the edge of Field 12, watching the dying soybeans. That particular field tormented him the most. He remembered perfectly how he had acquired it. It was the land of the old Miller family, who had farmed there for over 100 years. They didn't want to sell, but Walter used his power and influence to force the sale, claiming he needed that specific stretch to expand his central irrigation line. He had promised the Millers he would treat the land with respect. As soon as he closed the deal, he had the old wooden barn torn down and the small stream that ran through it diverted, changing the watercourse to optimize his technological irrigation. He never thought of it as violence. It was simply optimization. As he relived this memory, he saw a figure slowly approaching along the dirt road. It wasn't one of his employees. It was a small woman, dressed in simple clothes that seemed to have come from a bygone era. She carried a staff and a wicker basket. Era Mary O'Connell. Mary O'Connell wasn't an agronomist. She was the healer of Willow Creek, the herbalist, the woman the old farmers turned to when modern medicine failed. Walter always considered her a quaint charlatan, a relic of the past. She stopped at a respectful distance, but her piercing blue eyes fixed on Walter, and then on the barren field. "Mr. Sterling," she said, in a calm but firm voice that seemed to carry the weight of the earth. Walter sighed impatiently. He didn't have time for nonsense. "If you came to sell me prosperity teas, Mary, you can leave. I've already wasted too much time on solutions that don't work." Mary wasn't offended. She stepped forward, crossing the imaginary fence that separated Walter's world, the world of science and money, from her own, the world of nature and ancient wisdom. "I didn't come to sell anything, Walter. I came to see what you've done," she said, pointing her staff at the dying earth. "I saw your drones, I saw your chemicals, I saw your rush to force life to be born where it was no longer welcome." Walter felt anger rising. "I did everything right. I followed all the manuals. I paid the best experts in the world to tell me the soil is perfect." Mary gave a sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. She knelt down and touched the earth with her fingertips, as if she were caressing a wounded animal. "The land isn't a manual, Walter. It doesn't care about your expensive diplomas. It cares about respect. And you, my dear, violated it," she whispered, and the word violated echoed in the silence of the abandoned field. Walter was paralyzed. He had never thought of his business dealings in this way. Diverting a stream, uprooting centuries-old trees, forcing the land to produce 3 times what it would naturally yield, all of this was simply efficiency. I violated her. What are you talking about? I treated her better than anyone. I fertilized her. I watered her. You suffocated her with your arrogance, Mary interrupted him, still on her knees, her head bowed. You took this land from the Miller family, remember? They treated it like a partner. You treated it like a slave, forcing it to bear fruit without rest, without soul. You changed the course of the water, which is the earth's lifeblood. You felled the ancient oak in Field 9, which was the guardian. You wounded her deeply, Walter, and she is grieving. Those words, simple and direct, struck Walter harder than all the scientific reports. He remembered the old oak. He had ordered it cut down because it cast too much shade on a small part of the field, which would reduce the efficiency of the sunlight. Sam, the foreman, had begged him to leave it standing, saying the tree had been there since before Willow Creek was founded. Walter laughed and sent the cutting crew the next morning. The earth is not a bottomless pit from which you can take whatever you want, Walter, Mary continued, rising and wiping the dust from her hands. It has a memory, and now it's on strike. It's refusing your seed no matter how much you pay for it. Walter felt a lump in his throat. He, the man who commanded an empire, was being reprimanded by a woman who gathered wild herbs. And worse, he felt she was right. He had acted with brutal coldness, thinking only of profit. What can I do? The question came out almost as a whisper, and he hated himself for begging for help from someone he despised. Mary looked at him, and the hardness in her eyes softened slightly, revealing a deep sadness. First, you have to understand what you've done. It's not a problem of the soil, it's a problem of the spirit. You need to ask forgiveness from this earth, Walter, and forgiveness can't be bought with fertilizer. She turned around and started walking towards the fence. Mary, wait. If you know what's going on, you know how to reverse this. I'll pay whatever it takes. Tell me what to do. Walter shouted, despair filling his voice. Mary stopped at the property line, where Elias Thorne's corn was beginning to thrive. She gazed at the vast expanse of Walter's failure. What you need to do is give back what you took, but not in the way you think, she replied. You need to show that you understand the value of the life you destroyed in the name of your greed. She pointed to Camp 12, the old Miller field, the one that was more desolate than all the others. You have to prepare a place for the earth to rest, a place that will not be touched by your machines or your chemicals, a place where nature can heal itself. And you have to do it with your own hands, not with those of your employees. Walter frowned. That didn't make sense. To deliberately leave a piece of land unproductive? What if I do that? What happens? Mary O'Connell clutched her wicker basket. If you do this with an open heart, perhaps, just perhaps, the earth will stop crying. But the fate of your harvest, Walter, will not be decided by your satellites. It will be decided by an ancient ritual, a sacrifice of time and humility. She then revealed what he needed to do, and the plan was so absurd, so far removed from anything Walter Sterling, the king of technology, could have imagined, that he almost laughed. But desperation and the fear of ruin kept him silent. He had to try because science and money had failed. I'll be back on the next new moon, Mary promised. By then, you must have prepared the resting place for the land at Field 12. If you fail, there's no point in looking for me anymore. Sterling Farms will be nothing but dust. And with that veiled threat, Mary O'Connell disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Walter Sterling, the millionaire farmer, alone in the middle of his dying empire, facing the one truth he never wanted to accept. He wasn't in control. He had to kneel before the land he had humiliated. Night fell over Willow Creek. Walter returned home, but not to his high-tech office. He went to the garage, grabbed an old pair of boots he hadn't worn in years and a rusty shovel. He knew that to save his fortune, he would have to step down from his pedestal and get his hands dirty in a way he never imagined. He needed to begin the work of redemption at Camp 12, and he needed to begin now, before the last vestige of hope evaporated like the moisture from its soil. The task was monumental. He had to dismantle the production machine and build a sanctuary of forgiveness, and he had only a few weeks until the new moon. The rusty shovel felt like it weighed a ton in Walter Sterling's hands. He pulled it from the dust of the garage, where it had been forgotten since his father last used it decades ago. Now, he, the man who commanded machines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars with a touch of a screen, stood there in the darkness of the night, in Camp 12, with a tool that looked like a medieval punishment. The first shovelful of dirt he tried to lift nearly made him fall backward. He was out of shape, used to pressing buttons and sitting in ergonomic chairs. His body, accustomed to the luxury of his Jeep's leather and the air conditioning of his office, protested immediately. A cold, sticky sweat trickled down his forehead, and he took a deep breath, hearing only the sound of his heart pounding in his chest. "An altar of rest," he murmured to himself, remembering Mary O'Connell's absurd words. He needed to dig up an area large enough to show respect, an area that would represent the rest he had denied the Miller family land. He decided he would make a 10 by 10 meter square, right in the center of the field that was suffering the most. Walter began digging awkwardly. He wasn't preparing the soil, he was just tearing it up. The soil felt hard and resistant, not because it was compacted, but as if it were defending itself. With each shovel stroke, he felt the frustration and humiliation growing. He wanted to yell for Sam, or better yet, call the equipment rental company and ask for a mini excavator. But Mary's voice was clear in his head. With his own hands. He worked until dawn, stopping only when his arms trembled uncontrollably. As the sun began to rise over Willow Creek, revealing the landscape of failure, Walter looked back. He had dug an ugly, uneven hole that barely covered 3 square meters. His hands were raw with blisters that had already burst and bled. He staggered back to the mansion, exhausted, and threw himself onto the bed without showering. For weeks, he lived this secretive routine. He didn't show up at the office or call his consultants. He isolated himself. Sam, the foreman, was the first to notice the strange behavior. Sam wasn't a gossip, but he was observant. He saw his boss leave the house before sunrise and return looking like a ghost, covered in dust. One day, Sam found him at Field 12 mid-morning, struggling to tear off a piece of the drip irrigation line that he himself had installed years ago when Walter bought the land. "Mr. Sterling," Sam called cautiously, "what are you doing? That line can still be used elsewhere." Walter, his face red with effort and anger, pulled the plastic tube with all his might, and it snapped shut. "I'm undoing it, Sam," Walter replied, breathless. "I'm undoing my stupidity." Sam blinked, confused. He saw the uneven hole, the patch of land where Walter was trying to rest. "So, what exactly is it for?" Sam asked. Walter stopped, breathing heavily, and looked at the foreman. He could have made up a technical excuse, but exhaustion had disarmed him. "It's to ask for forgiveness, Sam," he said, his voice hoarse. "The land is on strike, and I have to show that I won't force it anymore. This piece of land here will be at peace. No machines, no poison, no drip irrigation." Sam looked at Walter, then at the hole, and a small, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his sunburnt lips. "Well, Mr. Sterling," said Sam, grabbing a pair of leather gloves that were hanging from his trousers, "if you're going to dig, wear gloves. And if you want the earth to rest, you can't just turn it over. You have to be gentle, you have to break up the clods lightly, let the air in without hurting it, let it breathe." Walter, the millionaire who paid fortunes for advice from PhDs, accepted Sam's bribes and the lesson in humility. He realized that Sam wasn't mocking him. He was simply sharing wisdom that Walter had ignored for decades. With the silent, unsolicited help of Sam, who didn't touch the shovel but gave him tips on the best angle to break up the clods and the correct way to support his body, Walter began to make progress. He worked 10, 12 hours a day. The Iowa sun was punishing, but he kept going. The process of dismantling the technology was as painful as digging. He had to rip the soil moisture probes, which cost thousands of dollars, and throw them onto a pile of scrap. He had to disconnect and drain the irrigation pipes he had diverted years before, remembering how the Miller family had cried when they saw the small stream forced into a new course. With each piece of technology he deactivated, with each square meter of soil he turned over with his shovel, he felt the weight of his arrogance lessen a little. The physical pain was a balm for the moral pain he had been feeling. The blisters on his hands turned into calluses and his body began to adapt. He lost the executive's shine, but gained the solidity of someone who truly works. The community, of course, was in an uproar. The neighbors would pass by on the road and see Walter Sterling, the king of technology, bent over the ground looking like a poor farmer. "He's gone mad," they said at the cooperative. "Losing his fortune has driven him crazy. Now he thinks he's a farmer." Elias Thorne, the successful neighbor who lived across the fence, watched the spectacle with a mixture of concern and satisfaction. He had nothing against Walter, but he always felt that Walter's thirst for domination was an affront to the way agriculture should be conducted. Elias saw Walter late one afternoon, kneeling in the middle of Camp 12. Walter wasn't digging. He was just touching the earth, examining it. At that moment, Walter was having one of his first moments of true reflection. He looked at the soil he had saturated with expensive fertilizers. He had tried to force life, but now, touching the loose earth, he realized it smelled of weariness, not death. He remembered the story of the ancient oak in Field 9, the tree he had ordered to be felled for the sake of efficiency. He felt deep regret. That tree was more than just wood. It was a landmark, a life he had cut short out of sheer greed. In Field 12, the resting place began to take shape. It wasn't a hole, but a perfectly level square of loose, soft earth, free of seeds, pipes, and chemicals. It was an empty space, a promise of peace. Walter realized that, instead of trying to dominate nature, he was begging for a truce. One morning, while working, he found a small piece of pottery on the ground. It was a fragment of an old plate, probably left by the Miller family. He held it in the palm of his hand, feeling the connection to the history he had tried to erase. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the piece of pottery, to Field 12, to the small stream he had diverted. "I treated you like an object, not like life." Humility was a new and strange feeling for Walter Sterling. 2 weeks flew by. Walter was unrecognizable. He was thinner, more sunburnt, and his eyes, though still tired, had lost the feverish gleam of greed. They now carried the stillness of someone who had learned to listen. The new moon was approaching that night. Walter finished the altar of rest the previous afternoon. He stepped away from the peaceful square of land, wiping the sweat from his brow. The contrast was stark. Around it, the soybeans were slowly dying, yellow and withered. Inside the square, the earth was dark, rich, and simply quiet. There was no life growing there, but there was the promise that life could return. He waited, sitting on a piece of log he had sawn himself. He was no longer impatient. He had learned to wait. As soon as the sun had completely disappeared and the first stars began to appear, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the gravel road. Mary O'Connell appeared. She was dressed as before, with her shawl and wicker basket. But this time, she didn't look like a picturesque figure. She looked like a priestess. She walked straight to Field 12, ignoring Walter, who stood there nervous. She went to the square of land he had prepared with so much pain and effort. Mary knelt down and touched the ground gently, just as she had done on her first visit. This time, however, she did not smile sadly. She simply shook her head slowly. "That's fine, Walter," she said without looking at him. "The earth accepted your silence. You didn't try to fill it with things. You left it empty so that it could breathe again." Walter felt immense relief, but also renewed fear. The physical work was done. Now came the part he didn't understand, the ritual. "What will we do now, Mary? What is the sacrifice of time and humility?" he asked. Mary stood up and looked at him. She noticed the change. The man in front of her was no longer the arrogant CEO, but a weary farmer. "The sacrifice isn't for the land, Walter. It's for you," she explained. "You need to show that you understand that life cannot be forced. You need to recreate the life you destroyed, not to reap, but to honor what you lost." She opened the wicker basket. Inside were small seedlings of native trees, wildflower seeds, and a handful of dark earth that smelled of moss and rain. "This is the last chance the earth will give you to prove you've changed," Mary said. "In this Field 12, where you committed your greatest violence against the Miller family and against the water, we will plant a garden. Not a garden of profit, but a garden of memory. You will plant these trees, these flowers, and you will divert the stream back to its original course." Walter's eyes widened. Diverting the stream back would be an extremely expensive and time-consuming engineering project, and if he did it, he would lose the optimization of his central irrigation system, which would affect the production of all the other fields, if they ever produced again. "But that's going to cost a fortune and take months," he protested. "Exactly. It's a sacrifice of time and humility," Mary confirmed. "You will spend your money and your time to undo the harm you've done, and you will do this before you even think about planting anything to harvest. The Garden of Remembrance will be your payment to the earth." She took a small ceramic vase from her basket. "And now the new moon ritual," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper that seemed to carry the power of the wind. "You need a mediator. The earth doesn't trust you. We will plant on this resting altar, but the seed will not be yours. It will be the seed of a man who understands the cycle." Walter frowned. "Who are you talking about?" Mary pointed to the barbed wire fence where Elias Thorne's farm began. "You need to go to Elias Thorne, your neighbor, and ask him for a seed of his corn, the corn that thrived while yours died. You won't ask to plant and harvest it. You will ask for a single seed, pure, to be the testament to your redemption. You will swallow your pride and kneel before the man you always despised for not being modern." The idea of asking for help, and especially of begging from Elias Thorne, the man he considered an old-fashioned hillbilly, was almost unbearable for Walter. It was the ultimate humiliation. What if he refuses? He won't refuse, but you need to go to him with a pure heart, without talking about money or technology, just with the truth. Mary then explained the ritual. Walter was to bring the seed of Elias Thorne. In the darkness of the new moon, they would plant it in the center of the resting altar, along with the mossy soil that Mary had brought. This seed was not to grow and bear fruit. It would be the focal point of healing, the symbol of the renewed alliance between Walter and the earth. If Elias Thorne's seed germinates and survives in this soil that you have humbly prepared, Walter, then the earth will know that you mean business. And perhaps in the next cycle, it will consider bearing fruit for you again, Mary concluded. But until then, all your focus should be on the Garden of Remembrance and the stream. Walter looked at the vast expanse of his dying field, and then at the small square of land he had prepared. He had to choose between utter ruin and public humiliation. The fear of bankruptcy was great, but the fear of Mary O'Connell and the inexplicable force that was destroying his life was greater. "I'm going to Elijah," he said, swallowing his pride like bitter medicine. Mary nodded. "Go now. The new moon is almost perfect. I'll be here, waiting." Walter put on his simplest shirt and walked to the fence. The path to Elias Thorne's farm was short, but to Walter, it felt like a humbled man's journey through a desert. He crossed the fence and stepped onto Elias's land. Immediately he felt the difference. Elias's soil was firm, yet soft, and the scent of ripe corn hung in the air. He saw Elias Thorne in the yard cleaning tools. Elias was a simple man with a worn cap and an easy smile. "Walter Sterling," Elias said, surprised to see his millionaire neighbor, who barely greeted him at the gas station, appear there, dirty and tired. "What brings you to my humble farm?" Walter took a deep breath. He had to be honest without beating around the bush. "Elias, I need your help. My land is dying and science can't explain it. I was arrogant. I treated her badly and she refused to produce," Walter began, feeling the confession burn in his throat. Elias simply listened, his hands crossed over the handle of a rake. "I found Mary O'Connell, and she gave me a task. I need a seed," Walter continued, looking directly at the ground. "A single seed of corn from your field, to plant in field 12. It's not for harvesting. It's for a ritual, Elias, to ask forgiveness of the earth." There was a silence. Elias looked at Walter, not with scorn, but with a new seriousness. He knew that for Walter to make such a request, the situation was desperate. He knew the man was broken. Elias smiled, but this time, the smile was one of compassion. He turned and walked to a bag of seeds stored in his barn. He picked up a perfect golden kernel of corn and handed it to Walter. "We farmers depend on the land, Walter. We don't own it," Elias said, his voice soft. "I hope this grain brings you the peace you need." Walter picked up the seed. It was a tiny object, but it carried the weight of his entire redemption. "Thank you, Elias. I'll never forget this," Walter said, feeling a genuine emotion he hadn't felt in years. He ran back to Camp 12, where Mary O'Connell waited under the darkness of the new moon. Mary took the seed, the moss, and the dark earth from her basket. She knelt in the center of the resting place. Walter knelt beside her. "The earth has a memory, Walter. Honor what you destroyed. Promise that this space will never be forced again," she instructed. Walter made the promise aloud. Mary dug a small hole with her fingers, mixed Elijah's seed with the moss and dark soil, and covered it all with soil from Field 12. She did not use water. "Now we wait," said Mary, standing up. The ritual was complete. Walter had the rest of the night to reflect on his uncertain future. He had traded the certainty of technology for the hope of faith. Mary turned to leave but stopped at the fence. "Remember your work, Walter. The garden of memory and the stream. The earth is watching. If that seed germinates, it's just a sign. The rest depends on your sacrifice." Walter stood alone in the field, staring at the small patch of earth in the center of his resting place. He had lost millions, but he had gained a seed of hope. He knew that the work of undoing his past would be long and expensive, but for the first time in months, he felt he was on the right track. He was no longer fighting the land. He was working for it. And he needed to start planning the creek's reconstruction immediately. The survival of Sterling Farms depended on a single seed of corn. The shovel, once an instrument of punishment, now became an extension of his penance. Walter Sterling could no longer afford to dwell on humiliation. He had to think about survival. And his survival, strangely enough, depended on planting flowers and trees, not on planting corn for the market. The morning after the new moon ritual, Walter was in Camp 12, his face sunburned and his muscles aching, examining the seedlings Mary O'Connell had left in her wicker basket. They were small young oaks, maples, and seeds of wildflowers that didn't even have scientific names in his agronomy library. They were simply native, belonging to that place. He began digging holes for the trees. This time, he wasn't just turning over the earth, he was preparing homes. He remembered Sam's advice, be gentle. He used the shovel carefully, breaking up the clods with the tip of his foot, ensuring the hole was wide enough for the roots to spread without being choked. The work was slow and exhausting. Planting 10 small trees took him a whole day. He watered them with water brought in buckets, avoiding the drip irrigation system that was now inactive and dismantled. He could no longer rely on technology to do the work of the soul. "You have to nurture the memory, Walter," Mary had said. "Each tree is a year of rest that you owe to the earth." As he planted, he thought of the ancient oak he had felled. He felt that each sapling was an apology to that silent guardian he had silenced. The garden of memory was growing, a small oasis of hope amidst the disaster. The neighboring fields continued to wither, but in that 10-meter square there was a new energy, a resolute stillness. The community continued to gossip. They saw Walter, the richest man in the county, wasting his time and energy sweating to grow flowers that didn't yield any profit. Sam, the foreman, was the only one who understood. He didn't question, he just helped from afar. He left clean tools and fresh water near Camp 12, a silent support that Walter appreciated more than any consulting report. "You're getting better at working the land, Mr. Sterling," Sam remarked one day as Walter struggled to break up a particularly stubborn clod. Walter smiled, a genuine, weary smile. "I'm learning that the land is stronger than my money, Sam." But the memory garden was only the first part of the sacrifice. The real challenge, the one that would cost Walter most of his remaining fortune, was the creek. The small stream he had diverted years ago now ran through a concrete channel, optimizing water distribution for his central irrigation system. To return it to its original winding natural course, Walter would have to demolish the channel, excavate the stream's old route, which was filled in and covered with earth, and hire engineers to ensure the water would flow sustainably again, without causing flooding in the neighboring fields. He called his engineering team in Chicago. Their reaction was one of shock. "Undo the optimization? Mr. Sterling, this is a multi-million-dollar project. It's illogical," said his project manager. "Prepare a budget. We'll start tomorrow," Walter ordered, his voice firm. The cost was astronomical. He would have to sell the remainder of his most expensive tractors and most of his monitoring drones. He was liquidating the technology that defined Sterling Farms to pay for its reversal. The engineers came reluctantly. They used heavy equipment, but Walter insisted on being present every step of the way. He didn't just want the work done, he wanted it done respectfully. He wanted to ensure the creek would once again have its homeward path. As the excavators broke through the concrete of the canal and began digging up the old route, Walter felt a pang in his chest. He remembered how the millers had begged him not to touch the creek. The smell of the damp earth, now exposed after years of being buried, brought a wave of guilt. This was the natural course, Mr. Sterling. It meandered a lot, which reduced the efficiency of irrigation, explained a young engineer consulting an old map. Let it meander, Walter instructed. Nature doesn't care about efficiency. The creek project consumed the following weeks. Walter was exhausted, but the work kept him alive. He was paying the price for his arrogance, and each check he signed for the demolition and excavation was a step toward redemption. He was so focused on diverting the stream and tending to the small trees in the Garden of Remembrance that he almost forgot about the seed. About 10 days after the new moon ritual, Walter was in field 12, watering the maple seedlings with his bucket. The morning sun beat down on the resting altar, the earth he had prepared with his own hands. He approached the center of the square, where Mary had planted Elias Thorne's seed. Walter's heart pounded. He expected nothing. The earth was still in mourning. He knelt down and carefully moved the thin layer of earth with his fingertips, and then he saw. It was a tiny sprout, a wisp of pale green, barely breaking through the surface of the dark earth. It was minuscule, fragile, but undeniably alive. The seed of Elijah, the symbol of humility and wisdom that Walter had rejected, had germinated in the soil he had painstakingly prepared. Walter felt an electric shock run through his body. It wasn't the satisfaction of a deal closed. It was the raw, overwhelming emotion of being forgiven. He touched the sprout with a reverence he had never shown for his multi-million-dollar equipment. "It's life," he whispered. The corn seed, planted without fertilizer, without forced irrigation, only with Mary's mossy soil and Walter's humility, had responded. It was the sign Mary had promised. The earth was ready to listen. That same afternoon, Walter was overseeing the demolition of the last stretch of the concrete canal when Mary O'Connell showed up. She didn't need a phone or email. She seemed to know when the time was right. She saw the corn sprout on the resting place, and her lips curved into a satisfied smile. "What the heart plants with truth, the earth responds with life," she said, walking over to Walter, who was covered in concrete dust. She accepted," Walter said, barely able to contain his voice. "She accepted your promise, but the harvest is still far off, Walter," Mary warned, looking at the excavator working in the bed of the old stream. "The stream is your great reward. The water is the strongest memory of all. You need to restore the flow, and you need to honor the Garden of Remembrance." Walter nodded, understanding the gravity of the task. The seed was the proof of concept. The stream was the financial and temporal commitment. "I've already sold most of the equipment that wasn't essential. All the money is going towards that," he explained. Mary looked at him approvingly. "You're learning the difference between value and price, Walter. The value of water and land is infinite. The price of your tractors is just metal." The engineering work for the creek continued for weeks. Walter spent what remained of his emergency fund. He had to lay off some less essential employees, and Sterling Farms shrank considerably. He was becoming a real farmer, not an agribusiness CEO. Sam, who stayed by her side, helped ensure that the work was done without haste, respecting the soil and the riverbanks that were being restored. Finally, the day arrived. The concrete channel was completely demolished and removed. The original stream bed was cleared, waiting. It was a tense moment. If the water didn't flow properly, or if it caused erosion and flooding, Walter's sacrifice would have been in vain. The engineers opened the temporary gate that was holding back the water in the diversion. Slowly, the water began to flow into the new, old riverbed. Walter, Sam, and Mary were on the bank, watching in silence. The water, initially hesitant, began to pick up speed. It followed the winding path that nature had traced centuries ago. It meandered gently, finding its way through the newly excavated earth. There were no floods. The water seemed happy to be home. When the stream was fully restored, flowing gently and singing softly, Walter felt a profound peace. He hadn't earned a penny, but he felt richer than ever. Mary O'Connell caught a handful of the flowing water and threw it over her shoulder. "The water forgives what you did, Walter. The cycle has been restored," she declared. "The garden of remembrance is planted. The stream is flowing. Now the earth needs to rest." But the farm was still in crisis. The soybean and cornfields that had been planted before the sacrifice were irretrievably lost. Walter had to accept that this year would be a total loss. He needed a plan for the next planting cycle. "And now, Mary, when can I plant again? I need a harvest to survive next year," he asked, his financial worries resurfacing. Mary looked at him sternly. "You're still thinking about when and how much to harvest, Walter. You still haven't learned the main lesson. The earth's timing is not your timing. If you force it, it will close the door again." She explained that after the violence he had committed and the chemical saturation he had imposed, the land needed a sabbatical year, a whole year of rest, where nothing would be planted except organic cover crops, like clover or alfalfa, to nourish and heal the soil without the pressure of generating profit. "You will sow what heals, not what sells," Mary said. "You will spend more money on seeds that you will not harvest. This is the ultimate sacrifice of your greed. You will prove that you can love the earth for what it is, and not for what it gives you." Walter swallowed hard. A year without production? That would mean selling more assets, perhaps even the mansion itself. It would mean living on the brink of bankruptcy, but with the dignity of someone who is doing the right thing. "I will do it," he replied without hesitation. "I will plant what heals." Mary nodded, satisfied. "Good. And what about Elias's corn?" Walter looked at the tiny sprout, which was now about 10 centimeters tall, growing strong and solitary on the resting altar. "He is our testimony. What do I do with him?" "It's not for harvesting, Walter. It's for remembrance. You'll let it grow, but when it yields its ear, you'll let it dry on the stalk. When the seed is ripe, you'll harvest it, but not to plant or sell. You'll keep it like a treasure, proof of your first forgiveness. And you'll ensure that all of Field 12, now with the Garden of Remembrance and the restored stream, remains at peace." The corn sprout, the only sign of life amidst thousands of hectares of failure, became the focus of Walter's life. He protected it from the wind and the excessive sun, caring for it as if it were a child. Sterling Farms, once a beacon of high technology, has undergone a radical transformation. Walter deactivated the precision irrigation system in most fields. He hired teams to plant organic cover crops, spending fortunes on seeds that wouldn't yield profit but would regenerate the soil. He spent most of his time in Camp 12, tending the Garden of Remembrance and watching the stream. He felt the earth calming down. Elias Thorne's corn grew. It wasn't a giant stalk, but it was strong and healthy. It flowered, and in due time, produced a small golden ear full of perfect kernels. Walter sat beside the ripe ear of corn, smelling the harvest he couldn't have. He had lost everything, but he had gained wisdom. In late autumn, when the ear of corn was dry and ready, Walter harvested it. He took it home not to the silo, but to a cedar box he had carved with his own hands. He kept the ear of corn for Elias Thorne, proof that humility had triumphed over greed. The neighboring fields, including Elias Thorne's, had a record harvest. Walter watched with surprising calm. He felt no envy, he felt hope. His neighbors had prospered because they respected the cycle. He was paying his due. The year of rest was a test of faith. Walter had to sell more property, drastically reduce his lifestyle, and endure the scorn of some. But he survived. He had the seed of Elijah, the Garden of Remembrance, and the restored creek. When the following spring arrived, Walter's land was different. Cover crops had been incorporated into the soil. The soil was soft, dark, and smelled of life. The memory garden was a burst of wildflowers, and the young trees were strong. Mary O'Connell reappeared, punctual as the cycle of the moon. "The land is ready for the next phase, Walter," she announced, looking at the fertile fields that hadn't been tilled for a year. "You've proven you can wait. Now you can plant to harvest, but under the rules of the land." She then revealed the last and most crucial instruction for planting the new crop, an instruction that Walter would have laughed at in the past, but which he now accepted as the only truth. He would have to completely abandon monoculture and chemical dependency. You're not going to plant corn alone. You're going to plant what the land asks for. You're going to plant in partnership, Walter, and you're going to plant with a ceremony of gratitude, not of demand. Walter was ready. He had lost his fortune, but he had recovered his soul and, more importantly, the respect of his land. He knew that this year's planting would be unlike anything he had ever done. Sterling Farms would be rebuilt, not on technology and greed, but on humility and cooperation with nature. He was about to plant his first crop of redemption. The land was ready. Spring in Willow Creek had never seemed so full of promise, and the scent of the soil, which had rested and been nourished by organic cover crops, was sweet and rich. To Walter Sterling, that scent was worth more than all the millions he had lost. Mary O'Connell was in the middle of Field 3, a place he had been monitoring by satellite for 2 years. Now she was kneeling, her hand cupped, examining the land. Walter stood beside her, dressed in simple work clothes and a worn cap, looking more like an employee than the owner of the farm. "You made the sacrifice of time, Walter. Your greed has taken a step back. Now the earth has accepted your humility," said Mary, rising. "But the planting will be different. You will no longer force, you will invite." She explained to Walter that monoculture, planting only corn or only soybeans over vast areas, was what depleted the land and made it vulnerable. He had treated the soil like a machine, and machines break down. "Nature doesn't work alone, Walter. It works as a family," she continued. "You're going to plant in partnership. You're going to plant what the ancients called the 3 sisters. Walter, who only knew terms like biotechnology and yield per hectare, frowned. 3 sisters? Is that some kind of new organic fertilizer?" Mary smiled, a smile that lit up her wrinkled face. "It's not a product, Walter. It's life. It's the wisdom you threw away with your expensive tractors. You'll plant corn, but the corn will be the support. You'll plant beans, which will use the corn to climb, and at the same time will return the nitrogen that the corn takes from the soil. And you'll plant pumpkin or squash, which will cover the soil, preventing weeds from growing and retaining moisture like a protective blanket." The idea seemed absurd to Walter 2 years ago. It was inefficient. It was messy. There was no way a drone could map the planting density of 3 different species growing together. There was no way to optimize harvesting with gigantic machines. "But how am I going to harvest this? My combine harvesters can't separate the beans from the squash, and the corn will be mixed in," Walter stammered, market logic returning to his mind. Mary interrupted him firmly. "You're thinking about speed, Walter. You need to think about life. You'll harvest by hand or with small machines slowly. You'll accept the loss of efficiency in exchange for the guarantee of life. The earth doesn't need speed, it needs patience." Walter's shock was visible. He would have to dismantle his operation even further. He would have to hire more people, not to push buttons, but to actually work the land. "Where can I get these seeds?" "I only have genetically modified seeds," he asked. "You will ask," Mary replied, the word ringing like a bell of humility. "You will ask your neighbor, Elias Thorne. He and the other traditional farmers have the seeds that have adapted to this land for generations. Seeds that were not forced to grow, but that chose life here." The humiliation of having to ask Elias Thorne for seeds again was immense, but Walter had already swallowed his pride over the stream and the garden of memory. He knew he had no choice. He went to see Elias that same afternoon. Elias was repairing a fence, and when he saw Walter, he nodded, unsurprised. "Walter, your cover crops are beautiful. Your soil is breathing, I can feel it from here," said Elias. "I'm following Mary O'Connell's instructions. Elias, I need seeds. Corn, bean, and pumpkin seeds that you use. Seeds that know the land," Walter explained, getting straight to the point. Elias smiled. "The 3 sisters. A good choice, Walter. They take care of each other. I have seeds that my family has used for 50 years. They aren't the most profitable, but they're the ones that never fail." Elias gave Walter bags of seeds, not accepting payment in money, but in gratitude. "You're doing the right thing, Walter. The earth forgives those who repent," Elias said, shaking Walter's hand. Back at Sterling Farms, Walter and Sam met to plan the planting. Sam, who had witnessed Walter's technological folly and now saw his redemption, was visibly excited. "Mr. Sterling intercropping? It's the old way, my grandfather did it. It's more work, but the soil gets stronger every year," said Sam, tracing lines on the farm map with a piece of chalk. Walter sold what remained of his large planting equipment and bought smaller, older tractors and invested in hand tools. He hired local workers who understood the slow, careful pace of diversified farming. The planting day wasn't marked by lab reports and drones. It was marked by a ceremony of gratitude. Mary O'Connell came to Camp 3. Walter and all his staff were present. Mary didn't talk about science or profit. She talked about respect and cycles. She picked up the dried ear of corn that Walter had kept in the cedar box, the seed of Elias thorn that had sprouted in the garden of memory. "This ear of corn is proof that life returns when you treat it with reverence," said Mary. "It will not be planted for harvest, but for remembrance. It will be the centerpiece of our Field 3. It will remind us that the earth is a mother, not a machine." They planted the new crop at a pace Walter had never known. It wasn't the frenetic speed of technology. It was a human rhythm, measured and careful. They planted the corn, and soon after, the beans next to it and the pumpkin in the ground. Walter was in the middle of the fields on his knees, planting the seeds with his own hands. He felt the texture of the soft soil, invigorated by the year of rest. He was no longer thinking about commodity prices in Chicago. He was thinking about the exact depth the bean seed needed to sprout. He spent the following weeks obsessed with the growth. There were no charts on screens, just daily observation. He walked through the fields, noticing how the corn climbed strong and steady. He saw the beans twining around the corn stalks like green embraces. And soon the broad dark leaves of the pumpkin began to spread, covering the ground like a protective carpet. The synergy was impressive. The three plants thrived together. There were no signs of decline or rejection. The soil, nourished and respected, was responding vigorously. Meanwhile, the community watched with fascination. The farmers of Willow Creek saw Sterling Farms, which seemed to have shrunk in size but grown in vitality. Where once there had been the loud noise of machinery and the smell of chemicals, there was now a productive silence, only the murmur of the wind. Elias Thorne often came to the fence, not to mock, but to observe. "The three sisters are happy, Walter," Elias remarked one day, seeing the lushness of Camp 3. "You're letting them work together." Walter smiled, tired and happy. "I'm not in charge anymore, Elias. I'm a partner now." Summer arrived, and Walter's farm, once a dreary sight of brown and yellow, was now a vibrant mosaic of green. Elias's corn was tall and golden, but Walter's corn, planted in intercropping, was equally strong, with the beans spiraling upwards and the pumpkins covering the ground. The cost of slow manual planting was high, but the result was undeniable. The harvest promised to be abundant, perhaps not the largest in volume he had ever had, but certainly the healthiest and most resilient. Walter had to reintroduce machinery for harvesting, but these were smaller tractors, operated carefully so as not to disturb the soil. They harvested the corn first, then the beans, and finally the pumpkins. The process took longer, but the quality of the product was superior. When the first ear of corn from the new harvest was picked in Field 3, Walter held it. It was heavy, full of perfect kernels. It wasn't a miracle of science, it was a miracle of respect. He took the ear of corn to Mary O'Connell, who was tending her memory garden. The trees Walter had planted were taking root, and the stream flowed merrily. "It's a harvest, Mary," said Walter, his voice full of emotion. Mary picked up the ear of corn. "It's not a harvest, Walter. It's a reward. The land has paid you back the debt you paid to it." Walter, who had been a slave to profit, was now free. He had learned that wealth lay not in the quantity of money, but in the quality of life he cultivated. Sterling Farms was no longer the most technologically advanced farm in Iowa. It was now the healthiest farm. Walter had changed his approach from the top down. He stopped using harsh chemicals, relying instead on cover crops and crop rotation to maintain soil health. He invested what little money he had left not in drones, but in educating his employees, teaching them about soil biology and the importance of patience. Sam, the foreman, became his trusted partner, not just an employee. Walter Sterling's story of redemption spread far beyond Willow Creek. Neighboring farmers, who had witnessed the collapse of a technological empire and the rebirth of a farm through old-fashioned methods, began to question their own practices. Walter, the man who used to laugh at popular wisdom, was now the mentor. He organized seminars not in his nearly empty high-tech office, but at Camp 12, next to the Garden of Remembrance. He told the story of the ancient oak, the diverted stream, Elias Thorne's seed, and the year of rest. He showed the dried ear of corn kept in the cedar box as his true trophy. The impact of his change was profound. He not only saved his farm from bankruptcy, he changed the agricultural culture of Willow Creek. The following year, Walter prepared to plant again. He no longer had the arrogance of before, he had the humility of someone who knows he is subject to the whims of nature. He planted the three sisters again, but in a new field, and let field 3 rest with cover crops. He respected the cycle. Walter's fortune never again reached the peaks of his technological era, but his farm was sustainable, his harvest was guaranteed, and his profit, though smaller, was clean. He had traded the vulnerability of greed for the security of humility. One day, at the end of the season, Walter was in field 3, which was now covered by a green carpet of alfalfa, healing the soil. He knelt down and took off his glove, feeling the dark, soft earth between his fingers. It was alive. He remembered Mary O'Connell, who had quietly disappeared after the harvest, saying her work there was done. He had lost millions, but he had found something money could never buy: peace with the land. Sterling Farms was no longer a production machine, but an ecosystem. And Walter Sterling, the millionaire farmer who nearly went bankrupt because of his arrogance, was now the humble guardian of life in Willow Creek. He was ready for the next season, knowing that as long as he respected the land, it would sustain him. He had finally learned his lesson. The land is not a bottomless pit, it is a mirror, and it only reflects what you offer it. His future was no longer in satellites, but in the smell of damp earth. He was ready to continue his life, now as a true farmer, guided by wisdom and not by financial balance sheets. 3 years had passed since Walter Sterling planted his first crop of redemption, the Three Sisters, in the soil of Willow Creek. 3 complete cycles of planting, growing, and harvesting, all conducted at the slow and respectful pace that Mary O'Connell had taught and that Elias Thorne had practiced all his life. Sterling Farms had transformed. It was no longer a technological empire, but a model farm in sustainability and soil health. Walter no longer had the luxury Jeep. He drove an old pickup truck, and his expensive suits had been replaced by flannel shirts and muddy boots. He was thinner, stronger, and the worry map on his forehead had been replaced by the tranquility of someone who sleeps well. Profit was no longer the primary goal, but the natural result of a job well done. Harvests were smaller in volume, because he practiced crop rotation and let the land rest at regular intervals, but the quality of the corn, beans, and squash was unmatched. He sold his products directly to organic cooperatives and restaurants that valued purity, obtaining fair prices that ensured the prosperity of his farm and his employees. Sam, the foreman, was no longer a second-class employee. He was the master of intercropping and the guardian of practical wisdom. Walter trusted him completely, and the two spent hours discussing the health of the worm farms and the density of the cover crops, no longer satellite graphs. Field 12, the epicenter of his violence and later of his redemption, became the heart of the farm. The Garden of Remembrance flourished. The young oak and maple saplings that Walter had planted with his raw hands now offered cool shade. The small stream he had restored sang softly, and birds returned to nest on its banks. Elias's corn sprout, which had been the first sign of forgiveness, was no longer there, but the dried ear kept in the cedar box was Walter's most prized relic. And what happened to Mary O'Connell? She disappeared as quietly as she arrived. After the first successful harvest, she simply waved to Walter and continued on her way down the dirt road, letting him know that the land was now her only teacher. But Mary's legacy lived on in Walter. He became the missionary of humility at Willow Creek. He opened Sterling Farms to visitors, not to show off his technology, but to show off his soil. He taught younger farmers to plant the Three Sisters, to respect the creek, and to use cover crops. Walter Sterling's story was proof that greed destroys, but repentance and humility rebuild. One autumn morning, after a particularly bountiful harvest of pumpkins, Walter was in field 3. The harvest had been slow, largely manual, and he was exhausted but happy. The sun shone on the remains of the crop. He knelt down and took off his glove. He plunged his hand into the soil, which was damp and warm. He squeezed it. It wasn't the tired, crumbling earth of before. It was dark earth, full of life, with the sweet, earthy scent of fertility. He glanced at the fence where Elias Thorne was overseeing the ploughing of his own field. Elias waved to him, and Walter waved back, not as rival neighbors, but as colleagues, united by the same respect for the land. Walter Sterling had lost his identity as a tycoon, but had found his calling as a farmer. He had learned that satellites only show the surface, but true wisdom is buried in the ground and can only be accessed with dirty hands and an open heart. He stood up, brushed the dust off his trousers, and gazed out at the vast expanse of Sterling Farms. It was no longer a monument to his arrogance, but a testament to nature's patience. He was no longer the richest man in Willow Creek, but he was undoubtedly the most grateful. The land had given him a second chance, and he would never disappoint it again. He had finally found his place there, among the corn, beans, and squash under the vast and generous Iowa sky. The cycle was complete, and life at Sterling Farms had begun to flow again,